Hey, welcome to week 2, lecture 2. We want to consider this lecture maybe a little bit of a teaser. So far we've talked about the dynamics of like hegemony and power and the obstructions and barriers to cross-cultural engagement. But we've only really tipped our hat in our lecture on kenosis as to what engagement might look like. Now, this will be building throughout the course, our readings and our lectures. However, I want to tip a little bit more of my hat and start to think about how we can wrestle, how to enter into these cross-cultural situations well, even before we've been fully armed with our learning on cross-cultural intelligence or been able to assess the power structures within various cultures or leadership situations. We've got to be able to take some steps at some point. So what are the resources found within the Christian tradition to help us to start to take those steps toward entry? So far we've talked about kenosis as it relates to the incarnation. However, I want to talk about 4 concepts, some of which we will develop further throughout this course, but are rooted in our tradition in the Christian church that will, I believe, move us in the right direction towards engagement. These 4 resources are the Imago Dei and the recovery of our baptismal identity, the demolishing of walls of hostility in Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, hospitality, and friendship. I first want to turn to the concept of the Imago Dei. Livermore touches on this in chapter 5 of his book, in which he states, and I want to read a quote from him, "To understand and see the other as being created in the image of God is to recognize that he or she possesses special qualities that reflect God himself. No matter how different the other is, he or she, in part, is a reflection of God. The other was created as much in the image of God as you and I were." Though I appreciate his entry into this conversation regarding the Imago Dei, I don't feel like he takes it far enough. So first off, I want to suggest it's not that the Imago Dei is first based upon the differentiation of individuality as selves made in the image of God. I would say biblically, the Imago Dei roots us in a sense of community. The language of Genesis is one of plurality. It means that the Imago Dei is not first and foremost individuality that comes together. Though it encompasses our unique differentiation as human selves, it's first and foremost rooted in mutuality. The Imago Dei is discovered through the mutual sharing of life of people in relationships. Likewise, the Imago Dei conversation ought to necessarily take us into the reflection on the Trinity. To be made in the image of God is to recognize the internal differentiation within the Trinity as 3 are 1, not at the expense of threeness, but in the mutuality and the love of oneness. To be the Imago Dei means that we've been made in this community of otherness, but not at the expense of oneness. And this is lost at the fall, but is sought again throughout the arc of the biblical narrative, and in many ways is recovered in our baptismal identity. In his letter to the church in Galatia, one deeply divided over otherness, Paul writes, "So in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." In this passage, baptism becomes the reconstitution of human identity, a restoration in which difference isn't dissolved or nullified. It's simply that difference isn't necessarily divisive. All the categories that we appropriate for the purposes of segmenting identities and creating otherness have been brought within the scope of Jesus. And though difference remains, oneness of love and mutuality isn't sacrificed in the provision of division. This isn't simply an us, the baptismal community thing, versus them, the unbaptized. Our baptismal identity and recovery of the Imago Dei transforms our posture towards all and sees them as participants in the Imago Dei. The second resource in the demolishing of dividing walls. Found in the letter in the church of Ephesus, Paul writes these words, "Therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands, Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create for himself one new humanity out of two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he's put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who are far away, and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. In this letter, Paul is specifically addressing the division that existed between the Gentile and the Jew, one that was at both times theological and cultural. However, Paul wants to start at the point of inclusion rather than exclusion. Oftentimes, our cross-cultural engagement suffers within the church because of our bias towards qualifications for participation or inclusion. How much like us must one be in order to be considered like us? This is the primary argument that's taken up again and again through Acts chapter 15 in the council. However, Paul is asserting that the walls of division have been demolished in the cross. No longer is the beloved community of the saints neatly divided by legal regulations or ethnic birthright. Instead, Jesus has become the one through whom the promise of Abraham, the blessing of all nations, has come to pass. The cross, being the leveling ground, creates a new humanity. The beloved community is one of openness and engagement, not divisiveness, hostility, and exclusion. Now, this sets us up for another resource made available to us in the Christian church, and that's the concept of hospitality. Now, I have to acknowledge this, that hospitality is not unique to the church. Many cultures privilege hospitality as a high virtue and a lack of hospitality as a slight of character. But this is central to the movement of the early church. The rugged individualism and the exclusivist political and social identities of the modern West have made hospitality difficult or relegates it to a gathering at one's house to grill out. Hospitality should and ought to extend much deeper than that. Hospitality is less about hosting a space for a gathering and more about a posture of openness towards the other in our lives. Hospitality, in a sense, is a means through which we make room for the other, either at our table, our home, in our lives, in our friendships. It's a peaceful space where the violence of exclusion and that of suspicion are traded for the risk of vulnerability and transformation. Now, we'll discuss hospitality at greater length in this course, and for extended readings on hospitality, I'm deeply indebted to people like Henry Nouwen, Christine Pohl, Dorothy Day, and John Vanier. I love what Pohl says in her book, Making Room. A community which embodies hospitality to a stranger is a sign of contradiction, a place where joy and pain, crisis and peace are closely interwoven. Friendships forged in hospitality contradict contemporary messages about who is valuable and good to be with, who can give life to others. Such communities are also signs of hope, that love is possible, and that the world is not condemned to struggle between the oppressors and the oppressed, that class and racial warfare is not inevitable. The gift of hope embedded in these communities of hospitality nourishes, challenges, and transforms guests, hosts, and sometimes the larger community. Like I stated, the posture of hospitality will be explored in this course in greater detail. However, for now, I want to suggest to you that the imagery and spaces occupied by Jesus, parties, dinner tables, real and meaningful engagement, signifies to us that hospitable space of grace and mutuality, which ultimately leads us to our final resource. And again, I mentioned this in passing, but it'll be further explored in this course, which is the idea of friendship. Friendship is forged through genuine relationships of vulnerability, openness, and shared spaces. Friendship moves us beyond fascination with the other, toleration of the other, to a deeper embrace, a weaving of lives together where the differences and the dividing lines are blurred in love and care, a genuine interest in the other for the sake of the other, not just for the sake of some presumptive end. One need to go no further than John chapter 15 when Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. Friendship is a valuation of difference, a space where we are, despite our otherness, brought together into grace sharing. Now, throughout this lecture, I wanted to explore the four resources early on, even before we've had the opportunity to learn much about the technical knowledge concerning cross-cultural engagement or cross-cultural interpretation, so that we can begin to take those early steps towards those who, as we share space with, are the other, but who are along with us the Imago Dei. So that brings us to an end of lecture 2 of week 2. And we'll take a look at one more lecture for this particular week.